Turn that thing off. Margaret screamed, storming toward the house where 8-year-old Emma lay dying, connected to her dialysis machine. Rules are rules. I don't care if it keeps your brat alive. She had no idea Emma's father was the chief minister, and her nightmare was about to begin. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The screaming voice shattered the peaceful morning air as Margaret Pemberton stormed up the driveway of house number 47, her face twisted with rage. Behind her marched 2 other women from the HOA board, all looking like they were ready for war. Inside the house, 8-year-old Emma Matthews was connected to her dialysis machine, the rhythmic humming sound that had kept her alive for the past 3 years. Her pale face pressed against the pillow, dark circles under her eyes telling the story of countless battles with kidney disease. "Daddy, someone's yelling," Emma whispered weakly, her small hand squeezing her father's finger. David Matthews looked out the window and saw Margaret approaching like a hurricane of fury. His stomach dropped. As the chief minister of the state, he could handle political storms, but this woman had been terrorizing his neighborhood for months. What made it worse was that nobody here knew his real identity. He preferred being just a loving father, not a politician. The doorbell rang aggressively, followed by loud pounding on the door. "I'll be right back, princess," David whispered to Emma, kissing her forehead before reluctantly leaving her bedside. He opened the door to find Margaret's furious face inches from his own, her perfectly styled blonde hair quivering with anger. "Mr. Matthews, that industrial noise machine of yours stops today," she shrieked, pointing accusingly toward Emma's room. "Mrs. Pemberton, please lower your voice. My daughter is receiving medical treatment. I don't care if she's receiving a royal massage. That machine violates every HOA regulation in the book." Margaret's voice grew even louder, spittle flying from her lips. "Residential properties cannot house commercial medical equipment. It's industrial noise pollution." David felt his blood beginning to boil. "That's my daughter's dialysis machine. She has end-stage kidney disease. Without it, she dies." Margaret crossed her arms and smiled coldly. "Not my problem. Rules are rules. I don't care if it's keeping the president himself alive. It goes or you go." "She's 8 years old," David said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And I'm 53 years old and have been maintaining property values in this neighborhood longer than your brat has been breathing." Margaret snapped. "That machine is ugly, it's loud, and it's bringing down everyone's home values." David stared at her in disbelief. "Are you listening to yourself? You're talking about a child's life-saving medical equipment. Life-saving, property-destroying, same difference." Margaret waved her hand dismissively. "You have exactly 24 hours to remove that monstrosity, or I'm calling the authorities and having it seized as illegal industrial equipment." "You can't be serious." Margaret's eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction. "Try me, Mr. Matthews. I've had 17 families kicked out of this neighborhood for violations. Your sick kid won't be the first sob story I've ignored." The 2 women behind Margaret nodded in agreement, their faces showing the same heartless determination. David felt something dangerous stirring in his chest, a cold rage that few people had ever seen. "What kind of monster are you?" "The kind that keeps neighborhoods classy and valuable," Margaret shot back. "Your medical freak show belongs in a hospital, not in a respectable community." "Daddy!" Emma's terrified cry came from inside the house. The shouting had frightened her. David's protective instincts exploded. "Get off my property now." But Margaret wasn't finished. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. 24 hours, Mr. Matthews. Remove that machine or I'll make your life a living hell. And don't think I won't follow through. Ask the Johnson family how that worked out for them." As Margaret turned to leave, she called back over her shoulder, "Oh, and if that machine is still running tomorrow morning, I'll make sure everyone in this neighborhood knows exactly what kind of selfish people prioritize their sick kid over community standards." David watched in stunned silence as the 3 women walked away, Margaret's cruel laughter echoing across the peaceful neighborhood. He closed the door and rushed back to Emma, who was crying softly. "Daddy, why was that lady so angry about my machine?" David knelt beside her bed, struggling to control his voice. "Don't worry about her, sweetheart. Some people just don't understand. But she sounded really mean. Is she going to take my machine away?" David looked into his daughter's frightened eyes and made a promise that would soon be tested beyond his worst nightmares. "Nobody will ever take your machine away, Emma. I promise you that." But Margaret Pemberton was just getting started. That evening she called an emergency HOA meeting at her house. 15 neighbors gathered in her pristine living room, all wondering what crisis required such urgent attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret began dramatically, "we have a serious violation in our community that threatens everything we've worked to build here." She clicked on a presentation that showed photos of David's house, including telephoto shots of Emma's dialysis machine through the window. "The Matthews family has installed illegal industrial equipment in a residential property. This machine runs 24 hours a day, creating noise pollution and destroying our peaceful environment." Mrs. Chin, an elderly woman who lived next door to David, raised her hand. "Margaret, that's medical equipment for the little girl. She's very sick." Margaret's face hardened. "I don't care if she's dying, Helen. Rules are rules. We either enforce them equally, or this neighborhood turns into a medical district with ambulances and equipment trucks destroying our property values." "But she's just a child," protested Mr. Rodriguez from across the street. "A child whose family thinks they're above the law," Margaret snapped. "I've given them 24 hours to remove the equipment voluntarily. If they refuse, we take legal action." "What kind of legal action?" asked Mrs. Patterson nervously. Margaret smiled coldly. "I've already spoken to our attorney. We can get a court order to have the equipment removed as a public nuisance and industrial violation." The room fell silent. Several neighbors looked uncomfortable with the idea of targeting a sick child's medical equipment. "Margaret," Mrs. Chin said quietly, "this doesn't feel right. The little girl needs that machine to live." "Then she should live somewhere appropriate, like a medical facility," Margaret replied without a trace of sympathy. "This is a residential neighborhood, not a hospital." Unknown to Margaret, her presentation and cruel words were being recorded. Mrs. Chin had quietly activated the voice recorder on her phone, sensing that something terrible was about to happen. The next morning at dawn, Margaret was ready for war. She had spent hours on the phone with a lawyer friend who owed her favors, and she had managed to get what appeared to be an official court order to remove illegal industrial equipment from the Matthews property. What she didn't mention to anyone was that the document wasn't actually from a real court. She had forged it using legal-looking templates and official seals she had copied from legitimate documents. In her twisted mind, the end justified the means. Margaret arrived at David's house with two men she had hired from a medical equipment removal company, telling them they were repossessing illegally installed machinery. She also brought along 3 HOA board members as witnesses to the legal action. But David wasn't home. He was at the state capitol, attending an emergency session about healthcare funding. He had no idea that Margaret was about to attempt murder. Mrs. Chin, the elderly housekeeper who helped care for Emma when David was away, answered the door. "We're here for the illegal medical equipment," Margaret announced, waving her forged papers. "This is a court order requiring immediate removal." Mrs. Chin looked at the official-looking documents in confusion. "I need to call Mr. Matthews." "You can call him after we've removed the equipment," Margaret snapped. "This is a legal order. Stand aside." Emma was in the middle of her morning dialysis treatment when the strangers barged into her room. The 8-year-old looked up in terror as Margaret and her hired men surrounded her bed. "Please," Mrs. Chin begged, "she's having her treatment. You can't disconnect her now." "Watch me," Margaret said coldly. Emma's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the scary woman who had yelled at her daddy. "Please don't take my machine. I need it to get better." Margaret stared down at the pale, frightened child with no trace of compassion. "Rules are rules, little girl. Your daddy should have thought about this before breaking the law." "But I'll get really sick without it," Emma whispered. "Not my problem." Margaret nodded to her hired men, who began disconnecting the dialysis machine despite Mrs. Chen's desperate protests and Emma's terrified cries. "Stop. Please." Emma screamed as the tubes were removed from her small body. "I need my machine." "Should have thought about that before moving into a regulated community," Margaret said, watching with satisfaction as the life-saving equipment was loaded onto a truck. Mrs. Chen was crying as she held the traumatized child. She could die without that machine. Margaret shrugged. Then maybe her father will think twice before violating community standards. As the truck drove away with Emma's dialysis machine, Margaret felt a surge of triumph. She had shown the entire neighborhood that nobody was above the rules, not even families with sob stories about sick children. What Margaret didn't know was that she had just signed her own death warrant. Because David Matthews wasn't just another resident of Maplewood Heights. He was the chief minister of the state, and he was about to bring the full weight of governmental power down on the woman who had tried to murder his daughter. Emma collapsed in Mrs. Chen's arms just 30 minutes after the machine was removed, her body already showing signs of toxic buildup. Mrs. Chin frantically called 911 as Emma struggled to breathe. "Please hurry," she sobbed into the phone. "A little girl is dying because they took away her dialysis machine." When David's phone rang during the legislative session, his blood turned to ice at Mrs. Chen's words. "Mr. Matthews, you need to come home immediately. They took Emma's machine and she's very sick." David raced home to find ambulance crews loading his unconscious daughter into an emergency vehicle. Emma's face was gray and she was barely breathing. "What happened?" David demanded. "That HOA woman," Mrs. Chin wept. "She came with papers and men. They took Emma's machine while she was having treatment. She said rules were more important than the little girl's life." David felt something break inside his chest as he looked at his dying daughter. Margaret Pemberton had just made the worst mistake of her life. Because now she wasn't just dealing with an angry father. She was at war with the most powerful man in the state. And David Matthews was about to show her exactly what happened to people who tried to murder his child. At the hospital, doctors worked frantically to save Emma's life. The sudden interruption of dialysis had sent toxins flooding through her small body, and she was in critical condition. "Mr. Matthews," the doctor said grimly, "your daughter is fighting for her life. The abrupt termination of treatment has caused severe complications. We're doing everything we can." As Emma lay unconscious in the ICU, surrounded by machines and monitors, David sat beside her bed and made a phone call that would destroy Margaret Pemberton's world. "Richard," he said to his chief of staff, "I need you to mobilize every resource we have. I want a complete investigation into Margaret Pemberton of Maplewood Heights. Financial records, business dealings, tax filings, everything." "Sir, what's the situation?" David looked at his daughter's pale face, tubes and wires keeping her alive. "She forged legal documents to remove my daughter's dialysis machine. Emma is dying because of this woman's cruelty." "My God. What do you need?" "I want her destroyed, Richard. Completely and utterly destroyed. She tried to murder my child, and I'm going to make sure she pays for every second of Emma's suffering." "Consider it done, sir." The next morning, while Emma fought for her life in the hospital ICU, David's team was already in motion. Richard had worked through the night gathering intelligence on Margaret Pemberton. "Sir, you need to see this," Richard said, entering David's private office at the Capitol. "Margaret Pemberton isn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She's been running a criminal enterprise." David looked up from the medical reports he'd been studying. "Tell me everything." "For the past 5 years, she's been collecting unauthorized fines from homeowners, sometimes up to $500 per violation for things like grass being half an inch too long or mailboxes being the wrong shade of approved colors. She's pocketed over $200,000. What else? Her husband's construction company has been doing work throughout the neighborhood without proper permits. They've violated building codes, used substandard materials and bribed housing inspectors. We found evidence of tax evasion going back 7 years." David's jaw tightened. "Continue." "The most damning evidence is what we found in her home office. She's been keeping detailed files on every resident, personal information, financial details, medical records, family problems. She's been using this information to blackmail and manipulate people." Richard pulled out a thick folder. "Sir, she has files on families with disabled children, elderly residents with medical conditions, even families going through divorces. She's been targeting the most vulnerable people in the community." David felt his anger building to dangerous levels. "She's been preying on families like mine." "Yes, sir. And there's more. The court order she used yesterday? It's completely fake. She forged the entire document, including official seals and judge signatures. That's felony fraud." While David gathered evidence, Margaret was basking in her victory. She called her sister in another state to brag about her latest triumph. "You should have seen the look on that man's face when we took away his brat's machine," Margaret laughed into the phone. "These people think they can just move into our neighborhood and ignore the rules because they have some sob story." What Margaret didn't know was that her phone was now being monitored by state investigators. Every cruel word was being recorded as evidence. "The kid probably won't even die," Margaret continued callously. "These medical drama queens always exaggerate. But even if she does, it'll teach the whole neighborhood that I don't make exceptions for anyone." Her sister sounded shocked. "Margaret, you're talking about a child's life." "I'm talking about property values and community standards," Margaret snapped. "One sick kid isn't worth destroying an entire neighborhood's investment." At 6 a.m. the next morning, Margaret's doorbell rang. She opened it to find Agent Sarah Collins from the State Revenue Department, accompanied by 6 other officials. Margaret Pemberton? Yes, what's this about? We have a warrant to search your premises for evidence of tax evasion, fraud, and illegal business operations. Margaret's face went pale. There must be some mistake. Ma'am, step aside. We also have agents at your husband's business and your personal storage unit. For the next 6 hours, Margaret watched in horror as agents carried boxes of documents, computers, and files out of her house. Her neighbors gathered on the street, whispering and staring. Mrs. Chin stood with the crowd and quietly said, "Karma is real." By noon, Margaret's husband Tom was calling her frantically. "Margaret, what the hell did you do? They've shut down my business. They're saying I've been bribing inspectors and using illegal materials." "I don't know what's happening," Margaret stammered. "They have recordings, Margaret. Phone calls of you demanding kickbacks from contractors. How could you be so stupid?" "Tom, please. Don't call me again. My lawyer says I need to divorce you immediately to protect myself and the kids from whatever criminal charges you're facing." The line went dead. Detective Williams arrived at Margaret's house that evening with a thick file of evidence. "Mrs. Pemberton, we need to discuss your activities as HOA president." "I was just enforcing community standards." "Ma'am, we have evidence that you've been collecting illegal fines, keeping detailed surveillance files on residents, and yesterday, you forged legal documents to remove medical equipment from a critically ill child." Margaret tried to maintain her composure. "Those people were violating regulations. Mrs. Pemberton, the child you targeted has end-stage kidney disease. She nearly died because of your actions. You committed attempted murder." "That's ridiculous. I was following HOA rules." Detective Williams opened his file. "We have recordings of you saying, and I quote, 'Even if she dies, it'll teach the whole neighborhood that I don't make exceptions for anyone.' You said this about an 8-year-old girl." Margaret's face went white as she realized her phone calls had been monitored. "We also have testimony from 17 families about your illegal fee collection, harassment, and blackmail schemes." Word of Margaret's crime spread quickly through Maplewood Heights. Families who had been terrorized by her for years finally came forward with their stories. The Rodriguez family revealed how Margaret had threatened to have their teenage son arrested for loitering, unless they paid $1,000 in fake fines. The elderly Patterson couple showed documents proving Margaret had charged them $2,000 for excessive garden gnome violations, a rule that didn't exist in any official HOA document. The Wilson family, whose son had autism, testified that Margaret had demanded they pay $500 monthly to keep their child's disruptive behavior from being reported to authorities. Story after story emerged of Margaret's cruelty, greed, and abuse of power. The woman who had once controlled the neighborhood through fear was now revealed as nothing more than a common criminal. At the hospital, Emma slowly began to recover. The toxins in her system were gradually being filtered out, but the trauma of Margaret's attack had left deep scars. "Daddy," Emma whispered as David held her hand, "why did that lady want to hurt me?" David struggled to find words that wouldn't destroy his daughter's faith in humanity. "Some people are just very sick inside, sweetheart. But you don't have to worry about her anymore." "Is she going to jail?" "Yes, baby. She's going to jail for a very long time." Emma nodded weakly. "I hope somebody helps her learn to be nice to people. Even mean people deserve a chance to get better." David marveled at his daughter's compassion, even after everything she'd endured. 3 days later, Margaret was hosting her weekly HOA meeting when the doors burst open. 6 state police officers entered, led by Detective Williams. "Margaret Pemberton, you're under arrest for fraud, extortion, tax evasion, attempted murder, and forgery." The other HOA members watched in shock as Margaret was handcuffed. "This is insane," Margaret screamed. "I'm a pillar of this community." "Ma'am, you forged legal documents to remove life-saving medical equipment from a dying child. You've stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from residents. You've been running a criminal enterprise for years." As Margaret was led away, she noticed a familiar figure in the back of the room. David Matthews stood there, no longer hiding his identity. Beside him were men in expensive suits, clearly government officials. Who are you people?" Margaret gasped. Detective Williams smiled grimly. "Mrs. Pemberton, meet Chief Minister David Matthews. You know, the father of the child you tried to murder." Margaret's legs nearly gave out. "Chief Minister? But, you're just a resident." David stepped forward, his voice cold as winter. "I'm a father first, Mrs. Pemberton. A father whose daughter you nearly killed because you couldn't stand the sight of medical equipment that was keeping her alive. You forged court documents," David continued. You lied to intimidate a dying child and her caregiver. You've been stealing from families for years. You targeted the most vulnerable people in this community and made their lives hell. Margaret began hyperventilating. I didn't know who you were. I was just following rules. You knew exactly what you were doing, David replied. You looked at my 8-year-old daughter dying in her bed, and decided your petty power trip was more important than her life. David turned to address the room full of shocked HOA members. Mrs. Pemberton has been stealing from all of you for years. She's collected hundreds of thousands in fake fines. She's taken bribes from contractors. She's blackmailed families with private information she had no right to collect. The room erupted in angry voices as residents realized they'd been victims of Margaret's criminal enterprise. The next morning, Margaret's story was front-page news across the state. HOA president arrested for attempting to murder disabled child, screamed the headlines. The story detailed how Margaret had forged legal documents to remove life-saving medical equipment from an 8-year-old girl with kidney disease, nearly causing her death. It revealed her years of theft, fraud, and abuse of vulnerable families. Margaret's phone rang constantly with reporters wanting interviews, but she was too devastated to speak. Her husband had filed for divorce and taken their children to his mother's house. Her friends refused to take her calls. Her family disowned her. The woman who had once been the most feared person in Maplewood Heights was now completely alone. At her trial 6 months later, Margaret faced a courtroom full of her victims. Family after family testified about her cruelty, her theft, and her abuse of power. But the most devastating testimony came from David Matthews himself. Your Honor, David said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, Margaret Pemberton didn't just commit financial crimes. She attempted to murder my 8-year-old daughter out of pure spite. She forged legal documents to remove life-saving medical equipment from a critically ill child. She looked into the eyes of a dying little girl and felt nothing but satisfaction at enforcing her arbitrary rules. David's voice broke slightly. My daughter Emma has spent most of her short life fighting for survival. She has endured countless procedures, endless pain, and constant fear. Through it all, she has maintained a spirit of kindness that amazes everyone who meets her. Margaret Pemberton saw that beautiful, innocent child and decided that her power trip was more important than Emma's life. That level of cruelty is beyond human understanding. The judge listened gravely, then addressed Margaret. Mrs. Pemberton, your actions were not just criminal, they were inhuman. You showed a level of callousness toward a suffering child that shocks the conscience of this court. Margaret was sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted murder, fraud, extortion, and multiple other charges. 1 year later, Emma Matthews was thriving. A compatible kidney donor had been found, and her successful transplant had given her a normal childhood. She was back in school, playing with friends and dreaming about her future. The Maplewood Heights neighborhood had transformed into a genuine community where people cared for each other. A new HOA board, made up of compassionate residents, focused on helping families rather than harassing them. David had used his position to pass Emma's Law, legislation protecting families with medical needs from HOA harassment and establishing strict penalties for abuse of homeowner association power. In prison, Margaret faced a harsh reality. Her crimes against a disabled child had made her infamous among inmates, who had their own code of justice when it came to people who hurt children. She lived in constant fear, isolated and despised by everyone around her. The woman who had once terrorized an entire neighborhood was now the one cowering in corners, afraid of her own shadow. But perhaps her greatest punishment was the haunting memory of Emma's face on that terrible day, the frightened little girl begging her not to take away the machine that kept her alive. Margaret had written dozens of letters trying to apologize, but they were all returned unopened. The Matthews family wanted nothing to do with the woman who had tried to murder their daughter. Years later, when Emma was a healthy teenager, she asked her father about forgiveness. Do you think that lady ever learned her lesson, Daddy? David considered the question carefully. I hope so, sweetheart. Sometimes people need to face severe consequences before they understand the harm they've caused. Emma nodded thoughtfully. I hope she found peace with herself. Carrying that much hate and cruelty must have been exhausting. David smiled, amazed by his daughter's wisdom and compassion. You have the biggest heart in the world, Emma. Your mother would be so proud. I learned it from you, Dad. You showed me that even when people hurt us, we don't have to become like them. Margaret Pemberton served 12 years of her sentence before being released on parole. She emerged from prison a broken woman, physically and emotionally destroyed by the consequences of her cruelty. She moved to a small apartment in another state, working minimum-wage jobs and living in anonymity. The woman who had once wielded power over an entire neighborhood now struggled to pay rent and buy groceries. Meanwhile, Emma Matthews grew up to become a pediatric nurse, dedicating her life to caring for sick children. She established a foundation providing medical equipment and support to families dealing with childhood chronic illnesses. The foundation's motto, inspired by her own experience, read, "Every child deserves compassion, care, and the chance to live." Emma never spoke publicly about Margaret Pemberton or the woman who had tried to kill her. Instead, she focused on healing, helping others, and proving that love is always stronger than hate. David Matthews served 3 successful terms as chief minister, with Emma's law becoming a model for other states. His greatest achievement, however, was raising a daughter who chose kindness over revenge, love over hate. In the end, Margaret Pemberton learned too late that true power comes not from controlling others, but from lifting them up. Her legacy was one of cruelty and crime, while Emma's was one of healing and hope. The little girl who had once been at the mercy of a heartless woman grew up to show the world that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, the human spirit can not only survive but flourish. Margaret had tried to destroy an innocent child and ended up destroying herself. Emma had been saved by love and went on to save countless others. In the battle between good and evil, love had won decisively. And somewhere in a small apartment, Margaret Pemberton spent her days thinking about the 8-year-old girl whose life she had almost ended, and wondering if she would ever be worthy of the forgiveness that Emma had already found in her heart. The story that began with screams of hatred ended with whispers of hope. Justice had been served. Love had triumphed. And Emma Matthews proved that sometimes the strongest people are the smallest ones who refuse to let cruelty define their lives.